In the long history of how nations collapse, there is usually the thunder of cannon fire, the rhythm of marching boots, or the terrifying scream of exploding shells. But in the 19th century, the greatest empire of the Middle East was dismantled in a far quieter way. It was destroyed not by generals, but by accountants. It was defeated not by gunpowder, but by compound interest. This is the story of the first truly modern debt trap. It is the story of how the Ottoman Empire, once a superpower that had terrified Europe for centuries, was slowly strangled by the banks of London and Paris. It is a warning that still echoes powerfully today, because it reveals a brutal geopolitical truth. You do not need to invade a nation to control it. You simply need to own its mortgage. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must return to the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 19th century. To an outside observer, the empire still looked like a giant. Its territory stretched from the Balkans in Europe, across the mountains of Anatolia, down to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and across the vast deserts of North Africa. The Sultan in Istanbul ruled over millions of subjects and sat on a throne that commanded one of the most important crossroads of the world. Yet beneath this image of imperial glory, the foundation was decaying. The empire was economically ill. While Britain and France were racing ahead through the Industrial Revolution building factories, steam engines and railways, the Ottoman economy remained trapped in a medieval, agrarian system. It was a society of peasants and craftsmen struggling to survive in an age of machines. The Sultan's treasury was almost always empty. The tax system was outdated and deeply inefficient, relying on corrupt local officials who often stole half the revenue before it ever reached Istanbul. For centuries, the Ottomans had managed these problems by debasing their currency or seizing the wealth of powerful officials. But in the modern world, these old tricks no longer worked. The empire needed money desperately. It needed capital to build a modern army capable of defending itself against the aggressive Russian Empire in the north. It needed roads, telegraph lines, and modern institutions. It needed to look and behave like a European power if it hoped to survive. For many years, the sultans resisted borrowing from the West. There was a deep cultural and religious resistance to usury and a political fear of becoming dependent on Christian Europe. But in 1853, that resistance finally collapsed. The Russian Empire invaded Ottoman territory, igniting the Crimean War, a massive conflict the Ottomans could not afford to fight on their own. Britain and France, alarmed by Russian expansion, came to the Ottomans' aid. They sent soldiers, fleets, and weapons to the Black Sea, but they also sent bankers. The war was draining the Ottoman treasury at a terrifying pace. Soldiers needed wages, cannons had to be manufactured, and ships had to be supplied. Sultan Abdülmecid I was desperate. His advisors warned him there was no alternative. To save the empire, he had to break the ancient taboo and borrow money. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire signed its first foreign loan agreement with a group of British and French bankers. It was presented as a friendly lifeline and act of support from allies facing a common enemy. In reality, it was the first link in a chain of golden handcuffs. The loan terms were ruthless. The bankers knew the Ottomans were a risky borrower, so they demanded a heavy price. The bonds were issued at 80, meaning that for every £100 of debt the Sultan agreed to, he received only £80 in actual cash. The remaining £20 was taken immediately as commission and risk premium. Yet interest had to be paid on the full £100. This was the original sin of Ottoman finance. The empire was borrowing at a crushing effective interest rate while receiving far less money than it officially owed. And this was only the beginning. The cash that finally reached Istanbul felt nothing short of miraculous. Overnight, soldiers could be paid and supplies could be purchased. The immediate crisis faded away. The Russians were eventually pushed back, and the Sultan was flooded with relief and confidence. He believed he had discovered a secret weapon. With nothing more than a signature on a document in London, rivers of gold could be summoned to his capital. The war officially ended in 1856, but the borrowing never stopped. The Sultan and the Ottoman elite had tasted the forbidden fruit of easy credit, and they became addicted almost instantly. They gazed at the glittering capitals of London and Paris, the gaslit boulevards, the grand opera houses, the marble facades, and felt a painful sense of inferiority. They wanted Istanbul to shine just as brightly. They wanted to prove to the world that they were not the so-called sick man of Europe, but a refined, wealthy, and modern empire. So they began to spend. But the borrowed money was not invested in factories, irrigation systems, education, or industries that could generate future income. Instead, it was poured into symbols of status and prestige. And nothing represented imperial vanity more clearly than the Dolmabahce Palace. Sultan Abdülmecid decided that the ancient Topkapi Palace, home to his ancestors for 4 centuries, was no longer suitable. It felt outdated, too Eastern. He wanted a palace that could rival Versailles. He wanted a residence that might even make Queen Victoria envious. And so he ordered the construction of a colossal palace along the shores of the Bosphorus. Dolmabahce Palace is an architectural monument of staggering luxury. 14 tons of gold leaf coat its interiors. It houses the largest crystal chandelier in the world, a gift from the British Queen herself. Its staircase is crafted from baccarat crystal. Silk carpets line the floors. Italian marble covers the walls. It is undeniably breathtaking, but it is also a financial tombstone. Every brick of it was paid for with borrowed money. While peasants in Anatolia struggled to survive on dry soil with wooden plows, the Sultan was importing crystal from Bohemia and gold from France to decorate a palace he could not afford. The final cost reached 5 million Ottoman gold liras, nearly 1/4 of the empire's entire annual tax revenue. To cover these expenses, the Sultan returned to the bankers again and again, first in 1855, then in 1858, and once more in 1860. Each time, financiers in London and Paris were eager to lend. The commissions were enormous, and the interest rates were lucrative. They knew the empire was weakening, but they assumed Britain and France would never allow the Ottomans to collapse. The empire was simply too strategically important. This belief is known as moral hazard. The bankers took risks because they expected governments to rescue them if things went wrong. By the 1860s, Ottoman finances had turned into a textbook Ponzi scheme. Tax revenues were no longer sufficient to cover interest payments on existing loans. So new loans were taken out merely to pay interest on old ones. The empire was digging one hole to fill another. Debt servicing began to consume the state budget. Around 1860, roughly 15% of imperial income went toward debt payments. By 1870, that figure had surged past 50%. Consider what that meant. Half of every coin collected from a fisherman in Greece or a farmer in Syria was immediately sent abroad to pay interest to bondholders in London. There was no money left for the army. No funds for the navy. No investment in schools or infrastructure. The state was being hollowed out from within. To keep the system alive, the government turned to a group of local financiers known as the Galata bankers. These were mostly Greek and Armenian families based in Istanbul's Galata district. They acted as financial loan sharks to the state. Whenever the treasury ran dry before the next major European loan arrived, the Grand Vizier would approach the Galata bankers and borrow money at short-term interest rates of 18%, 20%, and sometimes even higher were demanded. It was nothing less than financial suicide. At this stage, the Sultan was Abdulaziz, who had taken the throne after his brother. Abdulaziz was a ruler with an enormous ego and a deep fascination with military power. He didn't stop at building palaces, he decided to build a navy. He looked at the British Royal Navy, the most powerful fleet on earth, and decided the Ottoman Empire should have one as well. He ordered massive ironclad warships from British shipyards. He purchased the newest artillery and cannons from Germany. For a brief moment, on paper, the Ottoman Navy became the 3rd largest in the world. But it was a fleet the empire could not afford to operate. There was no money for coal, no funds for maintenance. The ships sat idle in the Golden Horn, slowly rusting floating monuments of debt. The breaking point came in 1873. A financial panic erupted in Vienna and rapidly spread across the global economy, triggering a long-lasting downturn known as the Long Depression. International capital vanished almost overnight. European banks, struggling with their own liquidity crises, abruptly stopped lending. The music had stopped. At the exact same moment, nature delivered a second blow. A devastating drought struck the Anatolian heartland in 1873 and 1874. Crops failed. Livestock perished. The peasants who formed the backbone of the empire's tax base faced starvation. Famine swept across the countryside. When tax collectors entered the villages demanding payment, they found nothing but dust, empty fields, and bodies. Government revenue collapsed, but debt obligations remained unchanged. In the summer of 1875, Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedim Pasha studied the financial records and understood the truth. The game was over. The treasury was empty. A massive payment to European bondholders was due in October, and there was simply no money to pay it. He attempted to raise a new loan, but the markets were closed. No one was willing to lend to the so-called sick man of Europe. The empire faced a brutal choice: starve its own population to pay foreign creditors, or stop paying altogether. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued a decree that sent shockwaves through Europe's financial system. It became known as the Decree of Ramadan. The decree announced that the empire would slash its debt payments by half. 50% would be paid in cash, while the remaining 50% would be replaced with paper IOUs promising a 5% return. In the polite language of diplomacy, this was called a moratorium. In the unforgiving language of finance, it was a default. The Ottoman Empire was bankrupt. The reaction in Europe was explosive. Millions of middle-class investors in Britain and France had purchased Ottoman bonds because of their high yields. Clerks in England and shopkeepers in Paris watched their life savings evaporate overnight. Newspapers erupted in anger, accusing the Turks of deception and fraud. Britain and France's diplomatic support for the Ottomans quickly disappeared. This financial collapse invited immediate aggression. Seeing the Sultan isolated, broke, and abandoned, the Russian Empire seized its chance to finish what it had begun in Crimea. In 1877, Russia declared war. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 proved catastrophic for the Ottomans. The Ottoman soldiers fought with courage, but they were unpaid, undersupplied, and exhausted. Russian forces advanced all the way to the outskirts of Istanbul. They could see the minarets of Hagia Sophia in the distance. The empire was forced to accept a humiliating peace treaty, surrendering vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus. Yet the most devastating part of the treaty was financial. Russia imposed a crushing war indemnity, demanding more than 800 million francs as punishment. The Ottoman Empire was now trapped in an impossible position. It already owed hundreds of millions to British and French creditors, debts it had defaulted on. And now, on top of that, it owed an enormous sum to the Russian Tsar. The total burden of debt had now grown far beyond anything the empire could ever hope to repay. Far greater than the total value of the Ottoman economy itself. The empire was bankrupt. It was exposed and defenseless. It had lost its credit, its lands, and its honor. Sultan Abdulhamid II, who came to the throne in the middle of this chaos, sat inside his palace fully aware that he was ruling over a corpse. He expected the European powers to arrive at any moment to carve up what remained of his empire. But Britain and France had a different plan. They had no desire to conquer the Ottoman Empire by force. That would be expensive, chaotic, and politically risky. Armies would be required. Administrators would have to be installed. Instead, they chose a far more elegant solution. They decided to conquer the empire financially. If they could annex the Ottoman economy itself, they could extract wealth endlessly without ever needing to govern the population. In 1881, representatives of European bondholders arrived in Istanbul. They were not soldiers or admirals. They were bankers. They carried ledgers and briefcases, not weapons. They sat across from Ottoman officials and calmly dictated the terms of surrender. They were not interested in territory. They wanted control of the cash flow. These negotiations produced the Decree of Muharrem in December 1881. It was the death certificate of Ottoman sovereignty and the birth of the modern debt trap. The decree created an institution, unlike anything seen before in imperial history. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, known as the OPDA. This was conquest without invasion. The OPDA was not a branch of the Ottoman state. It was a foreign-controlled corporation, governed by a board representing the banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. Its headquarters stood in a massive fortress-like building overlooking Istanbul, a constant physical reminder of who truly held power. Under the decree, the empire's most valuable sources of revenue were handed directly to this foreign institution. The Sultan effectively admitted that he could no longer be trusted to collect his own taxes. That responsibility now belonged to the OPDA. Revenues from silk were transferred. Taxes on salt were surrendered. Fishing taxes, alcohol duties, tobacco revenues, and the stamp tax on legal documents were all legally placed under the control of European financiers. The OPDA built its own parallel bureaucracy. It employed more than 5,000 tax collectors. They wore uniforms, carried arms, and answered not to the Sultan, but to a board of directors in Europe. These agents spread across the empire from the mountains of Macedonia to the shores of Syria, entering villages. ports, and markets to collect wealth from the Ottoman people. When a fisherman pulled his net from the Bosphorus, part of his earnings flowed to a bondholder in London. When a farmer harvested silk cocoons in Bursa, the profit traveled to a banker in Paris. When a peasant bought salt for his daily meal, the tax ended up in Berlin. It was a state within a state. The Opte was brutally efficient. Unlike the corrupt and outdated Ottoman bureaucracy, it operated using modern European accounting methods. It constructed warehouses, improved salt production, and distributed disease-free silkworm eggs to farmers. The economy did grow, but it grew for the creditors, not for the citizens. Between 1881 and 1914, the Opte collected roughly one-third of the entire revenue of the Ottoman Empire. Pause and consider that number. 1 out of every 3 coins generated by the economy was extracted and sent overseas to service debt. The Ottoman government was left with the leftovers. It was expected to rule a vast empire, maintain an army, and sustain a royal court using only 2/3 of its own tax base. The result was permanent poverty. The state could not invest in education. It could not build domestic industries. It could not modernize infrastructure. The empire was locked into a vicious cycle of underdevelopment because any surplus capital was being siphoned off to feed the debt trap. The Sultan had become little more than a puppet in his own palace. He reigned in name, but the OPDA held the real power. If he wanted to build a school, a road, or a bridge, he had to check with the bankers to see if any funds remained. Usually, there were none. But the debt trap did more than drain money, it drained sovereignty. It became a tool for European powers to manipulate Ottoman foreign policy. And this opened the door for a new actor to enter the stage one that would steer the empire toward its final downfall, Germany. While Britain and France were content to squeeze the Ottomans for cash, Germany saw a long-term strategic opportunity. Kaiser Wilhelm II visited Istanbul and embraced the Sultan, claiming that the British and French were parasites intent on bleeding the empire dry. He promised that Germany was a true friend, eager to build the Ottoman state up rather than exploit it. The Germans proposed a massive infrastructure project that would reshape the map of the region, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. A steel artery connecting the heart of Europe to the oil fields of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, bypassing the British-controlled Suez Canal. For the Sultan, it was a lifeline. The railway would allow rapid troop movement to suppress revolts, modernize commerce, and tie the empire to a powerful military ally. But the question remained, who would pay? The Ottoman treasury was empty and under the control of the Opte. Germany offered a solution. We will lend the money. And so, a fresh cycle of debt began. Deutsche Bank became the main financier of the railway, but Germany was as predatory as Britain had been. The contracts were brutal. They included kilometric guarantees, obligating the Ottoman government to pay guaranteed profits to German companies for every mile of track, no matter the traffic. Even more dangerously, the agreements gave German firms rights to all oil and mineral resources found within 20 kilometers of the railway. In effect, the Sultan had swapped the golden handcuffs of the British for the steel chains of the Germans. By 1910, the Ottoman Empire had become, in practice, a German economic colony. German officers trained the army, German engineers ran the railways, and German banks controlled the new debts. Britain and France watched in fury, witnessing their influence slip while Germany gained a strategic foothold in the Middle East. The sick man. Debt had ceased to be just a financial issue, it had become a geopolitical spark pushing Europe toward World War I by 1914. The Ottoman leadership, now dominated by the Young Turks, realized they were trapped. Desperate to regain independence, they understood that as long as the debt remained and the Opte controlled the finances, the nation could never be truly free. When war erupted in Europe, the Ottomans made a fateful gamble. They allied with Germany. They believed that if Germany emerged victorious, they could cancel debts owed to Britain and France, abolish the Opte, and reclaim financial sovereignty. It was an all-or-nothing bet. On the day they entered the war, one of their first actions was to storm the Opte headquarters in Istanbul. British and French directors were expelled, and payments to London and Paris were immediately suspended. For a fleeting moment, the empire tasted freedom. But the gamble failed. The war proved catastrophic. The empire collapsed, but the debt endured. When Mustafa Kemal Ataturk established the Turkish Republic in 1923, following a brutal war of independence, the European powers returned with their ledgers. At the Treaty of Lausanne, The British and French. The European powers demanded that the new Republic of Turkey assume the debts of the fallen empire. Their argument was simple: Turkey was the successor state. You inherited the land, they said. You inherit the mortgage. Ataturk resisted fiercely. But he also understood that a new nation could not afford to isolate itself from the global economy. Turkey could not launch a new era as a defaulter. So he reluctantly agreed to pay. The debt was restructured, payments were reduced, but the obligation remained. The young Republic of Turkey, impoverished and shattered by war, spent its first 3 decades sending millions of dollars abroad, servicing the reckless borrowing of the sultans from the 1850s onward. The final installment on the Ottoman debt was paid on May 25, 1954, exactly 100 years after the first foreign loan. The story of the Ottoman debt trap stands as the ultimate warning about the dangers of financial dependency. The Ottomans had believed they could import modernity. They assumed they could purchase the appearance of greatness with borrowed money. What they failed to understand was that money is never neutral. Every loan is a tether, every bond is a chain. Britain and France never needed to storm Istanbul with soldiers. They did not have to occupy the cities. They simply waited for compound interest to do the work. They demonstrated that the most effective way to destroy an empire is not by attacking it, but by lending it more than it can ever repay. The sick man of Europe did not die of old age. He was foreclosed upon. And the lesson remains written in the red ink of the ledger. Sovereignty is not just about flags and borders, it is about solvency. If you do not control your debt controls you. I'm John, and this is the financial historian Debt Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who truly saw it coming.